two of the central figures in the impeachment scandal. The president's acting chief of staff and his secretary of state are under new scrutiny today. Acting White House chief of staff Mick Mulvaney caught in some dicey email exchanges with OMB officials in which he appears to be trying to reverse engineer the legal justifications for what former NSC official Fiona Hill called Donald Trump's domestic political errand of conditioning military aid and a meeting on investigations into the Bidens in 2016. The Washington Post broke that story about the White House lawyers' review of the events at the center of the impeachment inquiry, and they report, quote, the research includes early August email exchanges between acting chief of staff Mick Mulvaney and White House budget officials seeking to provide an explanation for withholding the funds after the president had already ordered a hold in mid-July on the nearly $400 million in security assistance. And brand new emails thrust Secretary of State Mike Pompeo ever closer to Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani is known to be under federal investigation by the Southern District of New York. Those new emails reveal conversations with Giuliani around the time the president's personal lawyer was angling for investigations into the Bidens and orchestrating that smear campaign against the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. From the New York Times, quote, the emails indicate that Mr. Pompeo spoke at least twice by telephone with Mr. Giuliani in March, as Mr. Giuliani was urging Ukraine to investigate Mr. Trump's rivals and trying to oust a respected American ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, who'd been promoting anti-corruption efforts in the country. Mr. Pompeo ordered Ms. Yovanovitch's removal the next month. One call between Giuliani and Pompeo was arranged with guidance from Mr. Trump's personal assistant, the documents suggest. And as we come on the air, we're waiting for news in the case that could move former White House counsel Don McGahn closer to cooperating with Congress and testifying about his time inside the Trump West Wing. It's a case that could have ramifications for the impeachment inquiry. The crush of bad publicity for all the president's men is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. From the Washington Post, White House Bureau Chief Phil Rucker, NBC News correspondent Carol Lee. With us at the table, former chief spokesman for the Department of Justice, Matt Miller, Democratic strategist Basil Smikle, and our friend Donnie Deutsch is back. Phil Rucker, take us through this blockbuster story that when it landed yesterday, my phone exploded with alerts and texts and emails. Take us through what you guys broke yesterday about those email exchanges where it looks like Mick Mulvaney's trying to conjure up some legal justification for putting a hold on funds that Congress had already authorized and the Pentagon and other agencies had already checked off from a policy perspective.
Yeah, that's right, Nicole. It's a great piece of reporting by some of my colleagues at the Post over the weekend that looks at the efforts by the acting White House Chief of Staff Mulvaney to come up with a rationale and an explanation for why the president withheld the aid temporarily from Ukraine. This effort was conducted after the aid was actually withheld, so it was sort of a look-back attempt to come up with a justification, a rationale, a number of emails between him or among him and other budget officials in the administration, and including some inquiries as to whether withholding that aid was even legal. This was all conducted, by the way, as part of a White House counsel's office review of that correspondence looking into this matter, and it just shows the extent to which Mulvaney, but others in the administration as well, were part of an effort to create a cover story for the president's decision to withhold that aid.
Phil Rucker, there's so much in this story. I want to read you one more chunk, but I've got two more areas I want to explore with you. And I want to get into this idea that the cover-up now appears to be inching as close as the crime in terms of the potential sort of blast radius for this White House and the people in it. But let me read some more of this great reporting. You guys report that also included in the review from the White House lawyers are email communications between OMB and State Department officials and others discussing why the White House was holding up nearly $400 million in military aid and whether the hold might violate the law. In December 2018, months before the Ukraine issue surfaced as a top priority for the president, the Government Accountability Office had warned the OMB it was not following the law in how it chose to disperse and withhold congressionally approved funds. I mean, this seems like a much bigger swath of of people that were concerned about criminality. I mean, I've just never seen concerns about breaking the law laid bare from so many different pieces. This is the intersection of OMB and state, the intersection of OMB and the Pentagon. All these witnesses testified that they couldn't figure out why it was being held up. It's being held up. Fiona Hill told us why it was being held up, for Donald Trump's domestic political errand.
Yeah, and let's just step back for a minute and take in the big picture here, which is that aid to Ukraine, which the United States has been providing for several years now, is appropriated by Congress. It's Congress's duty to determine how to spend taxpayer dollars in the budget process. And so that was the concern that administration officials here had about whether withholding it was a violation of law. This aid is a standard part of American foreign policy that predates the Trump administration. It's something the Obama administration was doing to help Ukraine defend itself from Russia, which in recent years has become increasingly aggressive with its neighbor in Ukraine. And you're right about the breadth of the effort inside the administration. It's not just the acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, but it was officials throughout the OMB, which is the budget office of the administration, as well as the State Department and elsewhere, trying to figure out sort of what their story would be, what the rationale, the explanation for withholding that aid might be, and frankly, trying to just determine what they were legally able to do, given the guidance that they'd been provided from elsewhere in the government.
Carol Lee, it's not the only devastating piece of reporting over the weekend. Brand new emails show that Mike Pompeo, what's the expression, being all mobbed up? Mike Pompeo was Rudied up. Way back in March, the phone lines were burning, and they were connected by no one other than Donald Trump's former personal assistant, who put Rudy on the phone with Mike Pompeo, who happened to sit in on that call where Donald Trump asked for a favor, though. What's the significance of Pompeo getting sucked not just into the congressional impeachment inquiry, but sucked closer to a man known to be under criminal investigation by the Southern District of New York?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things, Nicole. One is, Secretary Pompeo, we reported last week that there's tensions between him and President Trump for the first time, really, in their relationship over the impeachment inquiry. And specifically, the president's frustrated with him for hiring what he sees as deep staters like Bill Taylor, who was then the top diplomat in Ukraine after Marie Yovanovitch was pulled back to the U.S. So we now perhaps have a window into why Mike Pompeo one of the reasons why Mike Pompeo has managed to stay in the president's good graces so long, because he was willing to do things and wasn't protesting, the way, say, for instance, John Bolton was about what Rudy Giuliani was doing. So that's one thing. And then another is that Mike Pompeo has political ambitions. It's an open secret. Everybody knows it. He may run for Senate in Kansas. He certainly sees himself as a potential presidential candidate. And something like this, the more that comes out, could really damage him politically. So one of the things I think that people are looking for is kind of how he navigates this. He's kind of on an island right now. He doesn't have full backing given the tensions that he has with the president. There's not that relationship there in the same way it was a few months ago. And he's really lost the building over at the State Department, where he doesn't have the support of the people who work there. And so how he moves forward as more and more continues to come out is going to be a very interesting thing to watch.
Donnie, that's such an interesting point that Carol Lee makes. I mean, the question is never whether the men and women who go to work for Donald Trump will be embroiled in potential criminality and certain scandal. It's how they navigate it. And if Don McGahn is the model, so he spent 30 hours with Robert Mueller, told him everything he wanted to know, cooperated with that investigation, became the star witness of the obstruction report, but he's somehow reluctant enough to cooperate with Congress that he's able to sort of keep some of his membership cards in the GOP for whatever reason he'd want them. Mike Pompeo seems to be failing all of the standards that McGahn met. He doesn't look like he's willing to cooperate with anything, and he's failing the leadership test. I mean, I think the Friedman op-ed last week, calling him sort of a West Point graduate leaving his soldiers on the battlefield, was devastating. If you want to run for dog catcher, you can't be that guy. You can't be a guy who's so weak you leave your soldiers on the battlefield.
It's stunning, the cancer of Donald Trump, how everything he touches. And I wish we could fast forward 5 years. And in addition to all the president's men here, the Mulvaneys of the world, the Michael Cohens of the world, who did not navigate as well. I saw in jail a couple of weeks ago. That the Devin Nunes's of the world, that everybody he will touch, history will frown upon. And the big mystery for me, with all of these men, women, mostly men. What do they not get? I don't understand the human behavior, the soulless behavior, the wimp behavior of just being so submissive. I don't know what the spell Trump has over. Obviously, we talk a lot about a cult leader, but whether it is these buffoons we saw last 2 weeks on display, or as we start to see behind the scenes, or we saw Giuliani morph from a respected politician to a buffoon to a joke. What is it about this man? It's got to be one of the great psychological studies of all time that forces men to find their lowest core.
Well, I don't know how respected Giuliani was in some circles.
That's a good point, yes.
But that said,
I'm going back
no,
to
I know you are. But what's interesting to me, and I'll stay with this Giuliani piece for a second. If you've worked near an executive, governor, mayor, president, there are always individuals who are sort of extra governmental, right? There are always folks who exist sort of outside of the bureaucracy, outside of governmental sort of responsibility, that do things on behalf of that executive. But I have never seen, to your point earlier, someone who's effective, so pervasive throughout government, that they're engaging so many different facets, to the point where you have a president saying he's going to withhold congressionally approved funding to serve his own political needs. If that were a Democrat, if that were Barack Obama, the impeachment wouldn't even have to go through a hearing. He would have been pushed out of office a long time ago. But the fact that we are here is what is it's so disturbing. I have people on the street, voters who don't believe that Donald Trump will be convicted in the Senate, but are now asking for Giuliani's arrest and imprisonment. And so
Can I ask you a question? Because you always ask the question, because you've been around power closer than anybody at the highest level. If you were going to break it down and give a why people follow this guy so blindly when it's so obvious to us in the movie theater watching the lemmings going off a cliff. You worked for president. You've been around power your whole life.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
I mean, look, my observation, I mean, Pompeo fascinates me because he's not without ambition, he's not without a brain, and he's not without some conservative instincts, and he's willing to burn them all down. He's willing to burn down the three pillars of his future: conservatism. He's willing to burn down strength because he looks like a wuss, refusing to defend Marie Yovanovitch and Bill, all those guys, and to sort of submit to Rudy. He didn't just submit to Donald Trump. He submitted to Rudy Giuliani. And the fact, and I go back to McGahn because Pompeo isn't the first person to sort of have to look in the mirror and say, how far will I go? Don McGahn looked in the mirror, and the line he wouldn't cross was firing Mueller. And if you read, and I maybe have read it too many times, but if you read that second volume of Obstruction, it's about the lines Don McGahn wouldn't cross and the notes Annie Donaldson took documenting it. The fact that these guys didn't either read it and learn any of those same lessons, the line should be the line that Michael Cohen should do. I won't go to jail for Donald Trump. Because there are now, three guys going to jail: Roger Stone, Michael Cohen, and Paul Manafort. It's out there already. He's been there long enough that if you do Donald Trump's bidding, you will end up in jail. And I just can't believe Mike Pompeo can't land himself on the right side of that line.
I think with every one of them, and it's not just Pompeo, it's Mike Pence as well. It is power and corruption. And ultimately, the question is, how much are you willing to corrupt yourself to have access to power? And right now, Donald Trump is powerful, not just because of who he is, but because of the base he commands inside the Republican Party. He has been playing the music for the last 3 years that everyone in the Republican Party dances to. And I think the gamble that all of these individuals are making, Pompeo and Pence and everyone else in the administration, is that the music isn't going to stop, or at least it's not going to stop until they've managed to get their next office, whether it's Senate for Pompeo or presidency for either Pompeo or Pence. But the problem that all of them have with this scandal and with every other, I keep thinking about the Watergate formulation. What did you know? What did the president know? Yeah. When did he know it? It's different for these guys. It's with Pompeo and Pence. It's what did they know? When did they know it? And what did they do about it? And with every one of them, they knew everything. What we keep finding is they knew everything. They knew everything about this Ukraine scandal. They knew it from the beginning, and they did nothing. And if they did anything at all, it was to help the president execute this corrupt bargain, not to stand up for it or stand up to it. And the question with all of them is the music ever going to stop, and are they going to ever pay a price?
Well, I want to make the turn with you to Phil Ruckers, to the Washington Post. Great reporting, because I saw your tweet on this last night. I mean, the backstory, and Phil Rucker, I want to pull you in on this too, of the great Mulvaney scoop, is this is an investigation into Mulvaney's conduct by the guy who probably sits to his right or left at the White House senior staff meeting, the White House counsel. So this is against the backdrop of this White House investigating itself and throwing another guy. I mean, I guess he's already everybody under the bus, but maybe backing up over him.
Yeah, I'm a little curious at Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, at his decision to open this investigation in the first place. Usually, when you open an internal investigation like this at a corporation or inside the government, it's because you want to go turn yourself in and turn in the best set of facts to the authorities. This White House is never going to do that. It's not like they're going to produce the results of this investigation to the House and say, "Oh, here's what we did, and we either made these mistakes, or here's the evidence that's not incriminating." I don't think they've found any evidence that's not incriminating, or we haven't heard about it now.
Because it would have leaked.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. We would have seen it. It looks much. It's been reported that the White House counsel wants to be the White House chief of staff, and here he starts this investigation that magically finds fault by the White House chief of staff, and that leaks to the press. It looks to me like the White House is continues to be a den of vipers, where you have the White House counsel leaking about the White House chief of staff, and then you see this quote, this kind of snippy quote from OMB, Mulvaney's people, saying, "Well, it was approved by the lawyers at every step of the way." A little bit of finger pointing back at the White House counsel's office. It's like a very nasty place to work.
Well, and just to get in the weeds, because our viewers follow every twist and turn, Phil Rucker, the White House counsel is also investigating one of his deputies. I mean, Mr. Eisenberg, who's the White House counsel lawyer assigned to this, whatever you want to call it, pigpen of a mess, is also being reviewed. And it was his decision to store the notes from this call in a top secret server that I think one of the witnesses, Mr. Morrison, last week said was a mistake. That is also under scrutiny. So what do you know about the White House counsel's investigation into his deputy and the acting chief of staff?
Well, some days, Nicole, around here, it feels like everybody's investigating everybody else.
And leaking about it.
So I guess this is one of those days. But the investigation into the deputy White House counsel is significant because that stems to the decision that was made to put the notes, the transcript of the call between President Trump and President Zelensky into that secret server that's only supposed to be used ordinarily for more highly classified and sensitive conversations. That was a decision that, based on the reporting, at least, was made in the counsel's office and by that particular lawyer. And so that seems to be the investigation there. The broader investigation into Mick Mulvaney's communications that we've been talking about this afternoon is clearly an effort by the White House to just get its hands around what exactly went on here and to really understand all of the facts that they're having to deal with as they deal with scrutiny from Congress into the quote-unquote cover-up. And I think Matt made an important point that shouldn't be overlooked, which is that there's been tension here at the White House for months between the acting White House Chief of Staff Mulvaney and the White House counsel Pat Cipollone. They have a rather fraught relationship. That is not new, but it has been exacerbated by the impeachment inquiry, which has just ratcheted up the pressure on both of these men and created a great deal of conflict between them. And
my last question, we're talking about Pompeo not defending any of his folks. It's interesting that the first thing we heard about the White House counsel in the context of this scandal is that he will investigate his deputy, Mr. Eisenberg. Any visibility into how that office is holding up? It's a lot of strain at the moment. I don't know the exact status of that relationship at the moment. I don't think that investigation is over with, by the way, or if it is, we at least publicly don't know what the outcome is.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.